Hello, and welcome to part three of the Violence Free Minnesota's Housing 101 for Victim Service Providers series entitled Minnesota Housing Programs. My name is Kenosha Davenport. I am the Executive Director of the Sexual Violence Center in Minneapolis, and I will be your host today. This session will cover government housing programs here in Minnesota and the state and federal agencies that administer or fund these programs. This session includes important information for agency leaders and administrators to know, but advocates and direct service providers may also be interested. The information covered in this session will be familiar to some of you and may be new for others. A lot of the information in this session has been pulled directly from publicly available resources, which will be noted in our resource page for this series on our website. Understanding the landscape of housing programs, how they're interrelated, and sorting through the sea of acronyms used to refer to them can be confusing for many providers who are starting or growing housing work at their agency. We hope that this session will provide clarification for those of you who might not be familiar with them. Since the full universe of state and federal housing programs is very large, we will not be able to cover all programs in this one-on-one training or every detail about each program. But we have tried to include the programs that victim service providers will most likely encounter in their housing work, and to introduce information about the programs in an accessible way. Finally, we know that there is not nearly enough housing available in Minnesota to meet the need, and that much of what is available is unaffordable. We hope that gaining some familiarity with the programs and funding streams will help you consider what you can do to help increase the availability of safe and affordable housing for survivors in your community. Let's begin with an overview of government agencies involved with funding, programmatic standards, and other aspects of the housing picture. The primary federal agency that funds and oversees federal rulemaking and programming related to affordable housing and community development in the United States is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. HUD's programming, funding, and policy-making effort on preventing and ending homelessness, enforcing housing protection, such as fair housing laws, and increasing home ownership and affordable housing. The United States Department of Justice, abbreviated DOJ, is the umbrella agency for two offices involved with housing policy and funding: the Office of Victim of Crime, or OVC, and the Office on Violence Against Women, or OVW. OVW was established under the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. OVC oversees Crime Victim Fund, which are Victims of Crime Act funds, or VOCA. OVC is tasked with overseeing the allocation and distribution of VOCA funding through formula grants to states and territories based on population. VOCA is the largest source of federal funding for crime victim services. OVW distributes funding to support domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence services and criminal justice initiatives. The Department of Health and Human Services, or DHS oversees, regulates, and administers programs that address health needs and provide essential services. One of the programs the agency administers is the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, known as FIPSA, which provides funding to domestic violence shelters for shelter and related support services, as well as new funding for sexual assault services. The United States Internal Revenue Service, otherwise known as the IRS, is a federal agency that oversees guidance, regulation, and processing related to tax programs and payments. The IRS is not involved in housing programs at the same level as these other agencies, but it oversees tax credit programs like the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, as described in Part 2. Please view Part 2 in the series if you are interested in more information. Now we'll switch to state agencies and programs. The Minnesota Office of Justice Program, or OJP, is located in the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, or DPS. The office providing funding, guidance, research, technical assistance, and other leaderships with the goal of reducing crime and improving assistance for crime victims. OJP is the main agency that handles pass-through funding to victim service providers, or VSPs, to support shelter and victim service programming. OJP also have a specific housing specialist staff member that focuses on coordinating with state agencies, the State Interagency Council on Homelessness, the Domestic Violence, Sexual Assault, General Crime, and Child Advocacy Center coalitions in Minnesota, and VSPs to address issues at the intersection of housing and victims of crime. The Minnesota Department of Human Services, or DHS, oversees several different social services related areas of funding and programming across the state, including several shelter and housing related programs. The Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO, handles the distribution of various forms of shelter funding, including shelter capital, shelter services, transitional housing, and safe harbor house programming. The Minnesota Department of Health, or MDH, is responsible for public health, including disease control and prevention, environmental health, public policy, and the regulation of healthcare providers. Its mission is to protect, maintain, and improve the health of all Minnesotans, and to promote healthcare equity across the state. It also co-leads the Safe Harbor response in Minnesota, which ensures that young people experiencing sexual trafficking are treated as victims and survivors rather than criminals. The Minnesota House and Finance Agency, or the MHFA, is the state finance agency in Minnesota. In some ways, MHFA functions a bit like a bank, but through a government organization. The agency assists individuals, partners, programs, and communities to preserve and create affordable housing. The agency administers and oversees several different types of programming, grant funding, and lending efforts including mortgage lending programs, housing counseling programs, rental assistance programs, houselessness prevention programs, affordable housing development, and preservation funding. The Minnesota Interagency Council on Homelessness, or MICH, is a cabinet level body led by the Lieutenant Governor and is comprised of the commissioners of 13 state agencies or their representatives and the chair of the Metropolitan Council. MICH helps to coordinate, support, and provide leadership in the state's effort to move towards housing, health, and racial justice for people who are unhoused. We will summarize 10 programs in this session: Continuum of Care, Emergency Solutions Grant, Victims of Crime Act or VOCA, the Family Violence and Prevention Services Act called FIPSA, Office on Violence Against Women Transitional Housing, Minnesota Transitional Housing, Housing Stabilization, Housing Support, the Family Homelessness Prevention Assistance Program, and certain capital investment programs through the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. The Continuum of Care program, commonly called COC, allocates funding to support several types of local programming with the goal of preventing and ending homelessness. It is a regional or local planning group that coordinates funding, services, systems, and resources for individuals and families experiencing houselessness. It includes a wide array of stakeholders, including government and non-governmental agencies, such as victim service providers or VSPs. Each COC covers a defined geographical area, which can be a city, county, or regional area within the state. COC program funding is allocated annually through a competitive application process. Both HUD and local COCs are involved in the process. The local COC is the main contact and administrator for VSPs, which might wish to pursue funding. COC funding supports several programmatic areas, including rapid rehousing, transitional housing, joint transitional and rapid rehousing, permanent supported housing, and in a limited circumstances, homelessness prevention and supportive services. This funding also includes a set aside called domestic violence bonus funding that is specifically available to groups that provide services to survivors of domestic violence. This funding has provided valuable support for VSPs involved in housing work, but they are not limited to this pot of money if they wish to apply. More on the COCs will be covered in parts 4 and 5 of the series. The Emergency Solutions Program, or ESG, is a U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD program that allocates funding to local jurisdictions to assist people obtain housing who are experiencing a housing crisis, including houselessness. Each year, HUD allocates ESG funding to local governments such as counties, urban areas, or states. The amount each receives is established by a predetermined formula. In Minnesota, 6 cities and counties receive HUD ESG formula grants directly. These 6 areas are referred to entitlement jurisdictions. They are Duluth, St. Louis County, St. Paul, in conjunction with Ramsey, Minneapolis, Hennepin County, and Dakota County. These jurisdictions are responsible for overseeing ESG funds and allocating them to nonprofit organizations in their area. All the areas outside of the 6 jurisdictions are referred to as non-entitlement jurisdiction, or the balance of the state. The Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO, distributes ESG funding to local governments and providers in the non-entitlement jurisdiction. Eligible program types under ESG include street outreach, emergency shelter, homelessness prevention, and rapid rehousing. The Victims of Crime Act of 1984, or VOCA, funds direct services to crime victims that are provided by nonprofit agencies, local units of government, such as county attorney's office and police departments, and tribes. State administrators receive formula funding from the Office of Violence. State administrators receive formula funding from the Office of Victims of Crime, or OVC, and in turn distribute it through a competitive application process. Minnesota State Administrator is the Office of Justice Programs, or OJP. VOCA funding originates from the Federal Crime Victim Fund, established through the VOCA of 1984. The fund is not supported by tax dollars, but through sources such as criminal fines, penalties, forfeited bail funds, and special assessments. VOCA funding has a variety of eligible housing-related uses. For example, VOCA funds can be used to support emergency shelter, transitional housing, or direct financial assistance to help survivors relocate for safety reasons. This can include expenses such as moving costs, travel, rental assistance, or security deposits. The Family Violence Prevention and Services Act grant program, abbreviated FIPSA, is a federal funding source that supports immediate shelter and supportive services for survivors. FIPSA funding is administered by the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. State administrators receive formula funding from HHS, who then distribute it to victim service providers through a competitive application process. FIPSA funding supports a wide array of shelter programs and supportive services, including housing-related services. Some examples of eligible activities are shelter, safety planning, crisis counseling, and information and referral, legal advocacy, and additional supportive services. FIPSA also support coalitions and the National Domestic Violence Hotline. The Office on Violence Against Women, or OVW, administers a transitional housing program to support this service. Funding is allocated yearly by OVW through a competitive grant process. Victim service providers can apply directly to OVW for this funding. The OVW Transitional Housing Program funds transitional housing spaces, short-term housing assistance for transitional housing program participants, and voluntary support services for recipients of transitional housing, including counseling, childcare, transportation, life skills, and educational or job training. The Minnesota Transitional Housing Program, referred to as THP, is a state-funded transitional housing program. This program is administered by the Minnesota Department of Human Services Office of Economic Opportunity, or OEO. Funding is distributed through a competitive application process every 2 years. The program provides financial support for transitional housing spaces, time-limited rental assistance, and supportive services for up to 36 months with some possibilities for extension. Should your agency consider applying for THP funding, be aware that it is part of a combined request for proposals, or RFP, with multiple activities and multiple funding sources, and therefore you will not see an RFP for that program specifically. Instead, you will see a Department of Human Services Office on Economic Opportunity, Homeless Assistance Grants, RFP, with eligible activities including youth and adult outreach, shelter, transitional, and rapid rehousing. The Housing Stabilization Services Program is a newer program through Minnesota Medical Assistance, or MA. This funding supports housing-related services for people with disabilities and seniors who are unhoused or at risk of becoming unhoused, and can be a good referral source for advocates working with survivors on housing stability. Funding allocation. Housing Stabilization Services is not a grant program. Providers are paid for individual services delivered. Organization who wants to be a housing stabilization service provider must be eligible to enroll as MA providers to receive this funding. Providers are compensated based on an hourly billing rate for time spent providing services under this program. Eligible activities. There are 3 types of services provided under the program. Through consultation services, the provider helps a program participant make a person-centered plan regarding their housing needs, and if appropriate, the provider will help link a program participant to other services and benefits. Transition services include helping program participants with planning for, finding, and moving into housing. These services can include, but are not limited to, helping a participant identify and resolve barriers to housing, locating housing, completed tenant screening processes, conducting lease negotiations, or ensuring that a new living situation is safe. Sustaining services can help participants maintain their housing. These services can include, but are not limited to, assistance with housing recertification processes, education and support with lease compliance, maintaining income, benefits, or other similar services related to housing stability. There are some restrictions on housing stabilization services funding. Providers funded to provide consultation services usually cannot receive funding to provide transportation or sustainability. Generally, housing stabilization providers cannot apply to work with only one specific population of people. However, VSPs under this program can apply to specifically work with survivors, but they cannot limit housing stabilization services to survivors they are already working with. They must accept referrals to assist other survivors not currently involved with their agency. Also remember, housing stabilization services are reimbursed for services rendered, so the provider will only be compensated for the time spent providing services to individuals who meet the program's eligibility requirements. Eligible recipients are adults on medical assistance with a documented disability who are also eligible for waiver services such as the elderly waiver or the community access to disability inclusion waiver or CADI. Contact the Department of Human Services if you are interested in learning more about this program. The Housing Support Program, formerly known as Group Residential Housing, is a state-funded program administered through Minnesota Department of Human Services, or DHS. The program supports seniors and adults with disabilities and limited income with their housing needs. This can also be a helpful referral source when helping ineligible survivors seek housing. Nonprofits can apply to DHS to become a housing support provider. Housing support is not a structure like a traditional grant program. There are many technical aspects of the program that we will not cover here, but we will try to paint a general picture of how the program works. Housing support providers assist program participants with room and board costs, which include expenses such as rent, utilities, food, and some type of household supplies or other necessities. The amount of financial assistance each program participant receives varies by their individual circumstances. The financial assistance may cover all or only a portion of the program participants' housing and room and board costs. DHS and providers use a specific formula to calculate the amount of assistance each person receives. Contact DHS if you're interested in pursuing this funding or if you would like more information about the program. The Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program, FHPAP, provides supportive services and financial assistance such as rent deposit, rent payments, or utility payments to eligible households that are unhoused or at imminent risk of being unhoused. The Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, or MHFA, administers FHPAP. Regional areas throughout Minnesota, for example, counties can apply for funding for eligible activities. The regional areas, in turn, allocate funding to local providers through a competitive application. The regional areas, in turn, allocate funding to local providers through a competitive application. FHPAP can fund street outreach, homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing, coordinated entry programming, and direct financial assistance such as rent and rent deposits. MHFA has several forms of capital investment funding to support the acquisition, rehabilitation, and preservation of affordable housing in Minnesota, some that originate from state and others from federal funding. MHFA funding for housing development is generally not grant based, but comes in the form of amortized mortgages, deferred loans, tax credits, or other forms of financing support. MH capital funding is most often focused on large scale development and so will not be a resource for many VSPs. But if your agency is considering undertaking such a project to increase housing options for survivors, learning more about MHFA will be useful for you. If you're interested in exploring these programs further, contact MHFA for more information. MHFA distributes capital funding in primarily two ways: a consolidated request for proposals via rolling application. MHFA distributes a large amount of its capital through its annual consolidated request for proposals process. It is referred to as consolidated request for proposals because MHFA combines many different funding sources through one RFP. Developers do not apply for a specific funding source, but instead request funding for a particular project. If they are approved for funding, MHFA will designate which financing option the grantee will receive. MHFA also accepts applications on a rolling basis throughout the year for several financing opportunities. MHFA also distributes tax credits to support the development of affordable housing. In our last session, we described the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, or LIHTC, an IRS tax credit program administered in Minnesota by MHFA. Through this program, MHFA distributes tax credit to housing developers or their investors to decrease the tax liability for projects that involve construction, acquisition, and the rehabilitation of affordable housing units. We referenced this program in the last session of this series. States are required annually to create a plan to establish the criteria for how to distribute the tax credits, called the Qualified Allocation Plan, or QAP. The process is an open public hearing with the opportunity for comment. Some states have used the QAP to secure preference for housing for survivors. Minnesota has not yet done so. In the resources page, you will find information about QAPs and how to get involved in the process here in Minnesota. Other MHFA administered programs include the National Housing Trust Fund, which use deferred loans to increase the supply of multifamily rental housing in areas where there is an inadequate supply of affordable housing, and the Home Investment Partnership Program, or HOME, designed to create affordable housing for low-income households. HOME also allows state and local governments to use its fund for grants, direct loans, loan guarantees, or other form of credit enhancement or rental assistance or security deposits. VSP participation in the development of affordable housing can sustain VSP participation in the development of affordable housing to substantially increase the amount of survivor-centered housing availability. If your organization has identified development as a goal, connecting with MHFA and other local technical assistance providers is an important first step, even if it is not practical or possible for VSPs to pursue this type of development. There may be opportunities such as partnering with a developer on a project or collaborating with a developer to provide services. More information will be available in the resource section attached to this series on the Violence Free Minnesota's website. We are not able to cover all available housing programs in today's presentation. We chose to highlight the programs you will most likely encounter. In addition to those main programs, we want to quickly mention a few others before we end. The first, Heading Home Corps. This is an AmeriCorps program launched in 2021 that places temporary, full-time housing resource navigators, or HRNs, with housing providers across Minnesota. HRNs work with program participants to assess their housing needs and link them with resources to locate and or sustain housing. The Heading Home Corps program provides training to HRNs and assists with the cost of compensating the HRN. The Bridges Rental Assistance Program, funded by MHFA, provides housing assistance for people with mental illness and very low income while they wait for a housing choice voucher or another type of rental subsidy. Eligible uses for Bridges funding include temporary rental assistance payments and security deposit paid directly to the landlords on behalf of qualified participants. Priority is given to those who are unhoused, living in a regional treatment center, living in a community-based residential treatment facility, or living in substandard and unaffordable units. The Safe Harbor Program is a state-funded program that supports organizations providing trauma-informed shelter or housing with supportive services for youth who have experienced sexual exploitation and or sex trafficking. It is administered by the OEO in a biannual competitive application process. Homeless Youth Act funding, HYA, is a state-funded program administered through OEO. It supports outreach and drop-in programs, emergency shelter programs, and integrated supportive housing for youth experiencing houselessness and youth at risk for houselessness. OEO awards HYA funding through a biannual competitive application process. This is not a comprehensive list of available housing programs and potential funding sources. Additional resources may be available through local government, such as counties and cities, or even private and nonprofit funders. Connecting with local government officials should help you identify possible resources should you be interested. For more information about state and federal government funding and programs, please see the resource pages attached to this session and found on the Violence Free Minnesota website. Thanks to everyone who participated in the development of the series, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this session. We hope this discussion helped build a picture of available housing resource programs and funding sources available in Minnesota. We hope it is a useful tool as you continue the important work of helping to increase housing options for survivors of violence.